This is Go Nitro, The Rise of the Blades, Chapter 2, A Reunion. Another mannequin was loaded onto a spring, waiting for its moment. It had its back to the floor, with a weapon firmly in its hands. In an instant, the spring released, flinging the mannequin up and into the battle. Less than a second later, its head was engulfed in flames, sending its helmet flying off and falling with a smoke trail to the ground like a comet. Nick closed his hand into a fist and shook it in the air a little, nodding while he did. Another mannequin sprung up. Nick threw his hand forward, causing a perfectly round fireball to hit the mannequin directly in the center of its chest. A third sprung up, but was immediately disarmed by yet another fireball. Nick relaxed his stance as a timer on the wall read out his current record. Nick glanced at it for a moment before shaking his head a little, while turning away from the course. He grabbed a small towel off the back of a chair, wiping a little sweat from his forehead. The room had received some upgrades in the past week, including an improved fire range, a rest area, and Nick's personal favorite, a brand new 60-inch television. Dropping the towel back onto the chair, Nick grabbed the remote just as the door to his room slid open. "Finished training already, Nicholas?" Redmond asked, walking in. Nick shrugged, placing the remote back down. "Been trying to beat my time from 2 days ago," Nick commented. He stretched out his arms and sighed. "Must be past my prime." The door slid open again and a woman walked in, holding a tray of food. She approached the table and carefully placed the tray next to the chair. "Hope you like your steak medium rare, Nicholas," she commented with a smile. The smell of the food hit Nick and instantly his stomach began to rumble. "Wow, thanks, Linda," Nick stated. "I could have just gone to the cafeteria myself, you know." "Not today, Nick," she replied. "You have a busy day ahead of you." Nick raised an eyebrow as she turned and made her way to the door. Okay," Nick said quietly, before raising his hand and calling out louder. "And hey, tell Shay that whenever he wants that rematch, I'm ready. I've been practicing that game all..." Nick stopped and turned his sight to Redmond. Redmond folded his arms and patiently waited for Nick to finish. "All last night, after I was finished with my training, of course." Redmond shook his head and sat down at the table. "Nick, you really need to focus on handling your abilities," he stated. "I can't let you just run free with your new powers without first being absolutely sure you know how to control them." "Did you see my best time, Redmond?" Nick asked, motioning towards the firing range. He grabbed a carrot off the tray and crunched into it, continuing to talk while he chewed. "An accuracy? Oh man, don't get me started." Redmond adjusted his glasses slightly and began to open his mouth to reply. "I mean, how long are you planning to keep me in this lab before you finally let me go home again? I have things I need to see and figure out for myself. People I need to talk to." Redmond sighed and laid his clipboard down on the table in front of him. "Nick," he began. Oh, lost my place. "You don't have a home there anymore. You know very well the Nitro enhancement process took 2 years to complete. Your old house has probably been sold since then. There was no one to live in it." Nick nodded and leaned in a little closer to his food. "Yeah, but there have to be some more clues in that house, Redmond," he added. "I'm not going to go through life not knowing who took my family from me." Redmond glanced away, letting Nick finish. "And what about my cousin and my uncle?" he asked. "They live right down the street. Don't you think they want to see me?" "Dante Bruno?" Redmond asked, looking back up again. Nick stopped. A piece of steak was only inches from his face at the end of his fork. He lowered it a little and squinted his eyes. "Yeah," he said slowly. "We were pretty close." Nick put down his fork, never removing his stare from Redmond's eyes. "How do you know?" "Enlisted into Project Nitro at the age of 15, Redmond continued. He broke eye contact and looked down to one of his papers, reading it carefully. "The first one to awaken, and so far, the most proficient at controlling his abilities." Nick was silent. His mouth was slightly open, and he couldn't bring himself to close it. Redmond? He spoke in almost a whisper. What are you... You think you're the only Nitro, Nick, Redmond interrupted, tucking the paper away. But you're not. Redmond reached his hand into the inside of his coat, fishing something out of a pocket. He pulled out an electronic tablet and placed it on the table, sliding it forwards to Nick. Nick turned his gaze down to the screen as a video began to play. He instantly recognized the boy it was featuring. Tall, brown hair pushed forward into a spiked mess, a pointed chin, a bright white smile, and a focused determination in his eyes. It was Nick's cousin, Dante. Dante was talking to someone off camera, laughing and pointing to a few other people in the room. Nick watched in amazement as Dante turned away from the camera and threw his hand forward. A wave of crystal emitted from underneath Dante's feet and sliced its way across the ground, firing shimmering spikes up into the air as it went. It was like a creature, the way it moved. In what seemed like a millisecond, Dante lowered his hand again, and the floor before him was covered in a thick sheet of ice that glittered in light. Dante turned back around and held out his hands to the people standing off camera like he had just put on a show. Nick slowly shook his head and took in a deep breath. He tried to speak, but the words barely came out. There's others like me? Nick looked up to see Redmond nodding with a small smile. And Dante, but why would I just... Nick looked back at the screen and then up again. How many? Redmond grabbed the tablet off the table and began to tuck it into his coat again. 4 others, Redmond replied. Dante is one of them. Each Nitro has been granted a different ability to better serve their purpose on the team. Team? Redmond chuckled and leaned forward. Again, Nick, you think this is all about you. But it isn't. Redmond adjusted his glasses and shuffled through a few papers in front of him. He pulled out a few large photographs from within his coat and handed them to Nick. They were security camera photos of men wearing body armor, pointing weapons in all directions. They had the same symbol scratched into the chest of their combat vests. Some pictured the men throwing innocent people to the floor, or worse, stepping over the bodies of the ones who hadn't listened. What exactly am I looking at, Redmond? They call themselves the Blades, Redmond began, before Nick could even finish his question. Nick picked up one of the photos to study it closer. Yeah, he said slowly, digging through his thoughts. I remember them. They were behind a ton of robberies and muggings in Lattice Light City. Nick put down the photo, returning his eyes to Redmond. I'm guessing they didn't stop. Redmond shook his head and folded his arms. Worse than that, I'm afraid. The Blades came across stolen pieces of one of my past experiments, a substance called otrolium. After finding it, they built up their supplies and ranks. They've quickly become more of a military force than a gang. Organized, ruthless. An army hell-bent on finding the rest of the otrolium. Nick moved the photos until the final one came into view. He slowly lifted it off the table and began to absorb the horrible scene. 5 bodies lying in an alleyway. Their skin was shriveled up and hugging bone like a skeleton with fabric barely stretched over the top. The limbs from several of them had somehow crumbled into nothing but dust and were scattered across the pavement. On the wall of the alley, words were scribbled over the brick using a substance blacker than charcoal. We are the beginning. We are the end, Nick read softly. He shook his head slowly, still trying to drink in the image in front of him, but his brain was refusing to let him accept it. How could someone do this? He closed his left hand into a fist, staring down at the table. Why would someone do this? The leader of the Blades is a merciless, dangerous man, Nick, he stated, closing his eyes like he was trying to accept the reality. That's why you're here. You and the other Nitros. Nick looked back up. To stop the Blades? Nick asked. He glanced at the side at the target range. His brain instantly started replacing the mannequins with the soldiers he had just seen. That's how I'm going to make things right? Yes, Redmond quickly replied, opening his eyes. Nick, the Blades are responsible. Nick snapped his eyes back to Redmond. These men are responsible for the death of your family. Nick's veins were beginning to glow. He could feel the pressure building up in his hand. He looked down again and grabbed the photo, rereading the words written across the wall. The bodies in the photograph were people he had never met, but the more he stared, the more they started to resemble the ones he loved most. The ones he would never see again. Redmond watched as smoke started to wisp into the air and some small flames leapt from the edges of the photograph, curling them into black nothingness. A tear came to the corner of Nick's eye, a familiar tear that traced the same path down his face it had taken 1,000 times before. Nick closed his eyes. The photograph was now completely engulfed in flames. The heat of the room was rising. Nick could feel himself starting to lose control, fighting what was happening in his own mind. Redmond reached out towards the fire but stopped when a voice cried out in the chamber. "Nick!" it shouted. Nick's eyes shot open, dropping the photograph to the table, letting it crumble into nothing but ash. He snapped his head up and looked towards the door, seeing a young man step in. He had a massive smile painted on his face as he looked at Nick. Nick's mouth was wide open. He couldn't help himself. He pushed away from the table, causing it to bump into Redmond and almost knock the man from his chair. Nick stood up and took a step towards the young man. "Dante?" he asked. Dante's smile grew even larger, which Nick didn't think was possible, and he took off across the room. Dante hugged Nick so fiercely he had to take a step back, almost toppling to the ground. Dante's feet kicked with excitement in the air as Nick held him up. Dante threw one of his fists up in celebration. "Holy crap!" he yelled. "It's actually you!" Nick dropped Dante back to the ground, but Dante was still hyper, like an excited dog without a leash. Dante put his hands on Nick's shoulders, drinking in the realness of the situation. "Wow," he spoke again, beginning to calm down. "They told me you were here. I just kind of thought they were messing with me." "I told you," Redmond chimed in, while lifting his hands in the air. "None of my staff are going to mess with you, Dante," he said while making air quotes around the statement. "Dante," Nick began, still drinking this in. "How are you here? Why are you here? What about your dad?" Dante sighed, shook his head a little. Nick expected an immediate response. When none came, he knew that it wasn't good news. "My dad put up a great fight, Nick," Dante replied sadly. Dante's father had been sick for many years. The family had known, unfortunately, it was just a matter of time. Nick immediately made an assumption that that time had come. "I'm sorry, Dante," Nick said quietly and sincerely. Dante shrugged and smiled again. "Thanks, man, but he was in a lot of pain towards the end. I'm glad he's not hurting anymore. And hey, shortly after that, Phil here came up and invited me into the project. Help you make things right for yourself. Professor or Redmond will work fine, Dante." Dante threw his hands out to the side. "Oh, come on. Why can't we be on a first-name basis, Doc? I'm also not a doctor." "So, they did the procedure on you as well?" Nick asked. Dante turned back as his eyes sprung to life again. "Oh man, I totally forgot. Check this out, man." Dante lifted his arm into the space between Nick and himself and spread his fingers apart. In an instant, he slammed his hand into a fist, causing ice to erupt from the creases of his hand and crawl across his forearm. Some pieces of ice shot out a few inches and became dangerous-looking spikes. Dante rotated his arm around, showing Nick every side of the ice gauntlet he now wore. "Pretty cool, right?" Nick laughed and stared in amazement. "Dude." Dante lifted his other hand and put up one finger. "Also, this." He pushed his gauntlet outwards, causing a blade made completely of ice to spring out several feet. It shimmered in the light as Dante began to swing it around. "Ice sword!" he yelled. He continued to swing it, making lightsaber noises while he did. Nick was laughing at the display as his cousin began fighting off several invisible enemies. Dante spun completely around, bringing the sword in for a massive attack. He barely managed to stop in time before it hit Redmond, who was now standing only a few feet from him. Redmond didn't even flinch as the sword stopped mere inches from his face. He simply stared in an almost disappointed manner. "Are we finished here?" he asked. Dante's ice sword melted back into his hand, and he leaned in a little closer to the professor. "You are terrifying," he said quietly. Redmond turned towards the door and motioned over his shoulder. Come now, he called out to the two. Simon went to meet the others. Dante stood up straight again and turned to Nick. "Oh, dude," he started. "You're going to love these guys." "You've met them?" Nick asked. "Oh, yeah. We've been hanging out for a while." Dante started to head for the door, but turned around to face Nick while he walked backwards. "We were just waiting on you, man." Dante turned again and picked up the pace to catch up with Redmond. Nick's smile slowly faded away as the two disappeared out the door. He sighed and looked back down at the table. Looked down at the embers and ash left over from the photograph. Nick closed his eyes for a moment. "I'm gonna make things right," he spoke with purpose. His only hope was that his family could actually hear him. Nick looked back towards the door and ran to the exit. Chapter 3. A Team. "Look alive, people!" Dante yelled as he trotted into the room. Redmond followed close behind, shaking his head while he did. Nick followed in after him, cautious but intrigued. The room he entered was similar to his own room. Metal walls and floors, a solitary table in the center, and what seemed to be a form of firing range off to the side. "Did we just go in a circle, or—" Nick began. Dante quickly turned around and put his hands out to the side. No, he yelled back. "Don't be fooled. This place may look exactly like your room, but in reality..." He walked up to one of the chairs around the table and dropped down into his seat. "It is exactly like your room." Dante leaned back and popped his feet up onto the table. "But this is my place, at least for now." Nick was nodding through his cousin's speech, but was sufficiently distracted by something else. The three other people in the room around the two Brunos. All of which had their eyes locked on Nick, and none said a word. There was a tension in the room, and Nick had no idea why. "Everyone," Redmond started. "This is the final member of Project Nitro, Nicholas J. Bruno." The first to acknowledge Nick was a young man standing near the target range. He quickly turned on his heel and jogged over to the table. He had dark tan skin, sleek black hair, and a well-kept goatee. He was by far the largest person in the room, standing almost 6.5 feet tall, with shoulders that seemed wider than a car. He was wearing a big smile across his broad face as he ran up. Before he had even finished his approach, his hand was out and waiting. "Hello, Nick," he yelled through a thick Spanish accent. I'm not going to appropriately do a Spanish accent. I'm just warning you now. "It's so great to finally meet you." Nick slowly reached out and accepted the handshake. "Thanks. Nice to meet you too. Diego Cortez," he replied as he continued to shake hands with a force that made Nick think he might lose an arm any moment. "The professor has told us so much about you." "Not really," another voice added. This one was from a girl sitting at the table, strumming her fingers across the metal. Her shoulder-length brown hair was tucked behind her ears, except for a few strands hanging down in front of her left eye. Her eyes were locked on Nick in a focused stare without so much as a blink. Nick couldn't tell if she was genuinely interested or just trying to intimidate him. "What are you talking about?" Diego asked. "This is him, Nick Bruno." Nick cocked his head slightly. "Yeah, I get it," she stated as she slowly stood up. She approached the two and put her hands on her hips, looking Nick up and down. "Sure, we've heard his name a bunch, but nothing about the guy." She whistled for a moment, like she was calling a dog, to which Nick looked up and met her eyes. "So what's your deal, huh?" "Megan, that's not nice," Diego yelled. "Give Nick a break. He's only been awake for a few days." Nick shrugged and motioned towards the others. "Well, how long have you guys been up and about?" Dante sighed and stood up from his chair. "About a month there, Chief," he replied. "Apparently the DNA enhancers they used on you took a little longer to cook." "Close," Redmond interjected. "The binding agent we used to make sure the enhancements properly connected to your DNA was in a higher concentration. It took more time for your system to adjust." "But he still works, right?" Megan asked, pointing a thumb at Nick while talking to Redmond. "Like, his powers and everything?" Nick instantly put his hands up, stopping Redmond before he could respond. He took a second to roll out his shoulders, tilted his head to both sides, hearing a satisfying pop, before stepping forward. "Don't worry, Redmond. I got this one." He took a large step forward and tucked his hand behind his back, leaning like a professional pitcher lining up to the plate. He focused for a second, wound up, and hurled a fireball out of his palm. It careened across the room, leaving a thick smoke trail as it went. It cracked against the helmet of a mannequin, knocking it off and sending it crashing to the floor and skittering several yards away before coming to a smoldering stop. Nick grunted in satisfaction, stood up straight, and blew the smoke away from his fingers. Turned his eyes to Megan and raised his eyebrows. Pretty cool, right? Hey! Dante complained. That's what I say after I use my powers. He sat back in his chair and angrily folded his arms. Somewhat to himself, he said sulkily, makes much more sense. Megan looked back and forth between the two Brunos before sighing exasperatedly. She locked her eyes with Nick, and without even turning to look, threw her left hand out towards the firing range. A small purple orb began to materialize in front of her palm. It was so bright that Nick couldn't look directly at it. Megan was unfazed and kept glaring at Nick. The orb seemed to be spinning, as bright light and shades of purple swirled and darted around within its walls. After a few moments, the orb launched from Megan's hand and rocketed towards the range. Nick tried to keep his eyes on it to judge its accuracy. His hand was up in an attempt to shield his eyes from the blinding light. However, all he could see was the orb disappear into the sea of targets. The light faded into nothingness, and for a second, the room was completely still. No one moved. Nick began to lower his hand just as the immense light returned, even more brilliantly than before. It was immediately followed by a loud explosion which shook everything and everyone in the room. Nick stepped back as shards and broken pieces of the targets erupted from the range and clattered across the floor. Purple smoke billowed out and clouded everyone's vision, leaving the aftermath a complete mystery. As the smoke dissipated, the devastating landscape came into view. The range was completely obliterated. Nick's mouth slowly dropped open as he observed the destruction. Megan lowered her hand and took a step towards the shocked Nitro. That's more what I call pretty cool, she stated. She turned her head to look at Dante, who leaned back and put up both hands in surrender. Hey, he began. It's all yours. Megan nodded and turned back to Nick. That, Nick said between deep breaths, was completely irresponsible, Redmond roared. Nick could see a look of concern wash over Megan's face as she took a step back. Your powers are far too dangerous to use in your own little version of flexing your muscles. I thought we covered this already. Nick stepped in front of Megan and put his hands out towards Redmond. Hold up, Doc, he butted in. I'm not a doctor! It was my fault, Nick continued. He looked back at Megan and then to Dante. I'm sorry, I just keep forgetting that I'm not the only one, well, like this. Megan sighed and nodded. Yeah, she said, stepping up to Nick as well. That was stupid of me. Dante folded his arms and began nodding as well. Yes, Megan. Yes, it was, he said childishly. Thank you, Dante, she snapped. She turned back to Redmond. I swear I won't get out of control again. And Diego egged her on as he stood next to Dante. Dante closed his eyes and started to giggle to himself. Diego put a hand on Dante's shoulder and started to laugh quietly as well. Megan darted her eyes to the two and stared at them. There was only a brief moment before the two instantly stopped laughing and instead stared innocently up at the ceiling. And, she began, taking the hint from Diego, I'm sorry. Nick smiled a little and turned to Megan. He put out his hand. Let's try that again, shall we? He asked in as kind a voice as he could. Megan glanced down his hand for a second. Nick Bruno. Pleasure to meet you. Megan smirked and took his hand, shaking it a few times. Megan sods, and the pleasure is all mine. The moment of silence and understanding between the two was suddenly broken by some loud, obnoxious noises as Dante clapped as slowly and loudly as possible. Bravo! He yelled. Oh, that was just spectacular. Dante lowered his hands and sighed. As he did, he turned to look at the last person in the room, sitting at the table, with his hands folded in front of him. Nick had noticed him, but the boy had made 0 attempts at an introduction. He had very pale skin and blonde hair that was either a tangled mess up top or was dropping down in front of his face. He had very sharp features and a low brow that kept his eyes temporarily out of view. One of the most noticeable traits was the long scar that ran down his left eye and cheek. "What about you, huh?" Dante called out. The boy glanced up, meeting Dante's eyes. "What's your story there, Morning Glory?" The boy turned his eyes to Nick and strummed his fingers a few times. "Stephen Reynolds," he said quietly in his slightly rasped voice. He looked straight ahead as Diego moved behind his chair. "Oh, come on, Steve," Diego began. "Don't be so glum." "Please stop talking to me," he said in a monotone manner. Diego reached down and put his hands on Stephen's shoulders and began rocking back and forth. "We just want to be your friends, man," he reasoned. Stephen continued to stare off into the distance, not moving a single muscle. He spoke very clearly, as if his words were directed to everyone in the room. "I'm not here to make friends," he announced. "We have a job. I have a job. Nothing more, nothing less." Nick glanced over at Redmond, who was slowly shaking his head and pursing his lips. "Not a typical childhood," Redmond remarked to Nick. "You can't blame Stephen for that." Diego leaned down next to Stephen and rested an elbow on his shoulder. "No, but I can blame him for being a sourpuss." Diego got his face closer to Stephen and puckered his lips a bit. "Aren't you a little sore spot? Yes, you are." Stephen turned his head slightly so he could look at Diego. "I hate you." "But what about power?" Nick asked, interrupting. "What can you guys do?" Diego perked up. "Oh, right," he stated, twiddling his fingers in the air. He motioned Nick to follow him as he ran to the back of the room. Nick slowly followed past the other four. Dante stood up and followed as well. As they approached another area of the room, Nick noticed that the floor began to change. It went from consistent tiles to a few missing here and there to no floor at all. Eventually, the three were walking on top of nothing but soil and some patchy grass. "This is," Nick started, turning towards Dante, "a bit odd." Dante smirked but motioned his head towards Diego, essentially telling Nick to pay attention. Nick turned back as Diego stepped out of the center and out into the center of the uncovered area. He widened his stance once he reached his mark and dropped his arms to his sides. Nick couldn't see Diego's face from the angle, but it didn't matter. He could feel the concentration emanating from where Diego was standing. Diego put his palms flat towards the ground and then slowly lifted them towards his shoulders. As he did, the ground below him began to shake and shift. Nick could see fault lines quickly trace through the dirt and draw careful paths around Diego, before two sections of earth started to fight their way apart from the rest. The two patches quickly grew into two columns as they rose out of the ground under Diego's palms, a twisted marbling of dirt and rock. Diego turned his head to look over his shoulder at Nick and smiled. "Check it out!" he yelled back to the Brunos. Diego snapped back to position and took two massive steps forward, punching out his fists while he did. The two columns split from their base and took off like bullets. They slammed into the metal wall in front of him and shattered into shards and pebbles, but not before leaving two massive dents. Diego stayed locked in his position for a moment, taking a few deep breaths before relaxing and stepping back. He turned back to the Brunos and put out his hands. "Not bad, huh?" "Yeah, man," Dante remarked. "Pretty impressive. I think Redmond might have a conversation with you later about that wall, though." Diego raised an eyebrow before glancing back at the two colossal dents in the thick metal wall. "Oops," he quietly muttered. "Nothing to worry about, Mr. Cortez," Redmond announced from the back of the table. "I'm beginning to get used to actions like that one." As the three walked back from the dirt to the metal floor, Nick's eyes set on Stephen. He was still sitting at the table, not even turning to watch Diego's demonstration. As Nick got closer, he motioned his hands out to the sides. "So," he egged on. Stephen glanced up at Nick, still unfazed. Nick didn't say another word, but did move his hands like he was expecting something else. Steve sighed and slowly reached his hand across the table. He grabbed a glass of water and dragged it back to his body. He turned his eyes back to Nick one last time before waving his other hand in a circular motion over the table. Nick felt a strange uneasiness fall over him as Stephen's hand grew in pace. The surface of the table below Stephen's hand began to change and move as if the metal was beginning to boil. Then from the center of the movement, a blackness began to grow. It was the darkest shade of black Nick had ever seen, and there was no definite edges. Instead, it seemed to just fade off into nothingness. As Stephen continued the motion, the circle grew larger, until it was roughly 2 feet in diameter. Stephen stopped moving and sat back in his chair, motioning his hands towards the darkness. "Ta-da," he said deeply and without any hint of excitement. Nick stared at the marvel and leaned in to get a closer look. However, no matter how close he got, the circle never gained any more form. "Wow," Nick said, examining it further. Then he tilted his head and looked back to Stephen. What is it?" Stephen sighed and lifted his hand again, this time moving it in a circle next to him. Another black circle formed in the air next to him, and this time just floating without contact to any surface. Stephen then slid the glass of water across the table. Once it came in contact with the blackness, it tilted to one side and fell in, disappearing into the shadows. Almost instantly, the glass shot from the other circle next to Stephen and fell perfectly into his hand. Stephen nodded, lifted the glass, and took a sip. "Portals?" Nick asked. "That's pretty awesome. It's a bit more complicated than that," Redmond began. Nick stood up again as the 2 portals faded away until there was no trace of them remaining. "You see, scientists spent years researching the universe and what holds it together. The areas between stars and planets. We call this area the void. As we researched it further, we discovered that the void is completely made up of a substance called dark matter, and that this dark matter is present throughout the galaxy, including here. Therefore, I can use resonant dark matter in the area to connect myself to the void," Stephen added. "Those portals are actually more like gateways. I can enter the void from here and exit anywhere else in our universe." "No way," Nick said in almost a whisper. "So, people can go in?" "Well, yes," Remmer replied. "One." He lifted his hand and pointed towards Stephen. "The nitro enhancements we used on Stephen adapted his body to survive within the void. No one else can. And even Stephen would succumb to the forces if he was there given enough time." "Hear that, Reynolds?" Dante asked. "No going in there for quality time away from us." "Any time away from you will be quality time," he muttered back. "That's enough," Redmond interrupted. "I understand that you've hardly had any chance to meet one another, but the 5 of you are a team. You were inducted into Project Nitro to work together. I don't expect you to love one another, but I do expect you to respect one another. Each one of you holds incredible power in your hands, but together you are unstoppable." Nick and Dante glanced at each other and then back to Redmond. "You cannot take on this responsibility lightly. All of you know what it's like to lose someone close to you, to have them taken away." Redmond carefully darted his stare to the eyes of everyone in the room. "The Blades took them away from you, and they aren't going to stop there. If you can't end this, no one can." Nick nodded, mostly to himself, and then turned to look at the others. Megan and Dante were staring at Redmond while Diego and Stephen looked away. Both seemed to be digging new holes for memories they'd prefer to remain buried. These men and women standing next to him couldn't be strangers anymore. This was his team. The photos of the bodies left behind by the Blades were still fresh in his memory. He knew he was either going to stop the Blades with his new team or end up dead alongside them. "I'm willing to do this," Redmond, Nick spoke out, still looking at the others. Nick didn't move for a moment, choosing his next action carefully. He turned back to Redmond and nodded once more. "I've lost too much because of the Blades. We all have." "Hear, hear," Dante shouted. "I know not everyone here is lucky enough to have a family member on the team, but I'd be surprised if we didn't feel that way soon enough." Suddenly, Dante and Nick were pulled forcefully together as Diego threw his arms over their shoulders. "Already done, amigos," he added. Megan started to chuckle and folded her arms. She shrugged and stepped towards the others. "What the hell? Can't be that bad working with you guys, right?" "Yeah, I don't bite," Dante replied. He leaned closer to Megan and spoke quieter. "Much?" He growled like a cat, causing Megan to unfold her arms and place her hands on her hips. "That, what you just did there? That needs to not happen anymore. Got it?" "Message received," Dante quickly responded. "What about you, Stephen?" Diego asked. Stephen stared at the other 4, but still didn't stand from the table. He sighed and faced forward again before slowly raising one of his fists into the air. Yay, woo, go teamwork, he said dryly. I'll take it, Redmond snapped. He grabbed his papers off the table and nodded to the Nitros. Well then, follow me. Time to get you suited up and ready for action. Redmond turned away and began walking out, motioning the others to follow. I think the city is ready to meet you. And then that is the end of Chapter 3. So, there you go. That is... You have now been... Oh, man, my hair was doing that the whole time? Fuck, I just looked at the camera and saw my hair was like... out to the side.